This is the first of 3 short videos put together by the Centre for Economic and Social Rights, which look at the connections between fiscal policy, human rights, and the COVID-19 context. This first video introduces fiscal policy. It will be useful for those of you for whom this is a new topic, or for those of you that would like to have a quick refresher on some of the key elements of fiscal policy, some of the jargon that's commonly used when discussing it, and some of the key debates about it. Essentially, fiscal policy describes how governments generate revenue and how they spend it. So it's common to think about the resources that governments have like a pie. And we're interested in looking both at how big it is and how it's sliced up and who's eating what. Governments control the size of the pie. Then, in other words, they generate revenue in 2 main ways. The first is through raising money, which is primarily done through taxation, but also includes other sources such as fees and fines, profits from state-owned enterprises, foreign aid, and a number of other sources. They also borrow money. They borrow money from both public and private lenders, and those lenders can be domestic and foreign as well. And the terms and conditions that governments borrow on, the loan conditions, is something that affects their fiscal space. And that's a concept we're going to talk about a bit more in a second. The fiscal policy choices that governments make influence the economy. And it's important to note that they affect things like employment levels, like inflation rates, and like GDP growth. So it's a useful tool for governments to achieve particular policy goals. And what those goals should be are something that is not always straightforward and that there are different opinions about. The government's key fiscal policy document is its annual budget. The budget sets out how much money it intends to raise, its revenue, in other words, from what sources, how the money will be allocated to different line ministries, for example, and the overall balance. In other words, the difference between revenue and spending, which can be a surplus when they're spending less than they're raising, or a deficit when it's the opposite situation. And for activists who are interested in influencing decisions about national budgets, it's important to remember that it's not a single one-off document. It's a process that has many phases to it. And this diagram in the slide here, which is put together by the International Budget Partnership, sets out the 4 main stages of the government's budgetary process. And as you can see, there's different entry points for trying to shape both the debates that are influencing the decisions that are made about how money is raised and how money is spent. It's also important to remember too that government budgets are not set in a vacuum. They also often reflect multi-year economic plans, and those plans set out kind of more medium or long-term priority goals that the government has in terms of the economy. So I mentioned the term fiscal space earlier. Essentially, fiscal space describes the degree of flexibility that a government has over its fiscal policy decisions. There are different definitions of the term, but essentially it captures the idea that fiscal policy decisions shouldn't jeopardize a country's economic stability. And because of the way the global economy is structured, that's easier for some countries to do than for others. And the diagram here on this slide seeks to capture some of the ways that a country's fiscal space might get squeezed or might get constrained. So on the left-hand side, we have some of the factors that influence fiscal space. These include economic conditions, captured in indicators like debt ratios and currency exchanges, but they also include factors that are kind of more the rules of the game in a way. So that could include conditions agreed to in trade and investment treaties. It could also in some cases include specific fiscal rules, either constitutional rules or legislative rules that set ceilings on expenditure for either for particular sectors or for the government overall. And the right-hand side lists some of the key actors who have influence over these factors. And as you can see, many of them are international, and many of them are also non-state actors. They represent the private sector as well. And sitting in between these two spaces, kind of factors and actors, is the underlying economic ideology. In other words, the beliefs about the way an economy should run and to what end. And the dominant ideology that we've seen in the past 40 years, around the world, has been neoliberalism. We'll talk about that in more detail in the next video, but it's important to note that neoliberalism has really shrunk and narrowed the fiscal space that governments have, because it's really determined, it's had a very heavy influence on what's considered to be the priority goals of fiscal policy.